Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of the Seekers Forum. I hope you're having a very good weekend. And let's say hi to Jay Cobley. How are you, Jay?
Hello, Mark. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Welcome. So, this month, we're going to be looking at the gifts of fear. Now, what it is that fear has to teach us, and how we can use it as a helpful, if sometimes difficult, friend. Now, we don't often look upon fear as an ally. And yet, like so many of the so-called destructive emotions, fear contains hidden potential. There's a paradoxical dimension to fear where it can become both useful and enlightening. But like most powerful allies, fear requires careful treatment. It needs to be handled with mindfulness, modulated with discernment, as well as self-compassion. It's natural to experience fear. To be human is to be afraid, as everybody knows. The question is, how do we respond when we're afraid? Do we curl up in a ball and disappear? Do we blame the world? Do we blame our weakness? Do we feel sorry for ourselves? Or do we struggle to fight off our fears through denial or repression or self-control? None of which, as most of you know, works very well and often makes fear worse. Or do we open to our fears? Do we investigate them and make space for them and do our best to learn what they're trying to teach us? These are critical questions for all of us because fear is all around us at every moment. It's the very atmosphere through which we move as vulnerable beings in a dangerous world, as everyone knows. Though human existence has always been scary, the causes for anxiety and fear have multiplied many-fold in our era. We're barraged 24/7 by disastrous headlines, real-life causes to be terrified. From superbugs to fire tornadoes, poisonous waters, fishless seas. We're inundated with warnings of present and future destruction around the clock. COVID-19 only served to multiply this terror for a lot of people. You could say that the pandemic turned the planet into a kind of Earth-sized petri dish for propagating global panic. In a poll that aimed at measuring Americans' various fears, it was reported that some 70% of those tested live in dread of natural disasters, with comparable statistics applying to cyber terrorism, government corruption, civil war, random violence, and ending up homeless in the streets. 70% of those polled reported feeling that they were in a high state of fear and anxiety a good deal of the time. And of course, fear has terrible effects not only individually, but on society. Sociologists tell us that in fearsome times like these, we tend to regress, both individually and culturally. Violence, fundamentalism, tribalism, rejection of the other, as well as a reduction of empathy, seem to rise in direct proportion to perceived danger. Without veering into politics, which is not what we do in the Seekers Forum, it's enough to acknowledge that the trend toward authoritarianism across the planet is directly connected to the threat to global health and safety that's coming at us from so many directions these days. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who confronted the horrors of slavery and civil war, put it this way. He said, when the reigns of terror, madness, and malignancy are afoot, a total perversion of opinion can take place that turns society upside down. And that's what we see around us in our era. Oppressed by this ubiquitous fear, these tides of terrors all around us, we have a choice about how to respond. Do we turn fear into the enemy, or do we take the time to be mindful and say, come closer to me and tell me what you've come to teach me? And that's what we're going to be looking at this month. How can we use fear as a guide, as an ally, and as a teacher? What can it show us about our own minds, where we're clinging, what we're afraid of losing, how we're scared of disappointment or identified with negative predictions, how our aversions control us? Fear can show us what delusions, unhealthy expectations, and shadow predictions we might be conjuring in our own minds, because fear is symptomatic of these stories. In truth, the vast majority of our fears are stand-ins for deeper narratives. They're stand-ins for deeper narratives. Let me be clear. I'm not talking about normal, healthy fears that are connected to clear and present dangers in our immediate lives. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about fear in response to the imagination, which is where 95% of our fears arise from. They're not about self-preservation in an immediate sense or crucial to our survival in that imminent way, but rather come from what we're imagining, as the Finnish people say, the devils that we're painting on the wall. And this is a very, very important point because fear and imagination are closely connected. The superpower of imagination can either transport us to heaven or sink us into hell. Though imagination can be used to free ourselves of fear, as research shows, it can also be used to increase fear when we allow it to run away with us. It's interesting to learn that people with less active imaginations are shown to be less overwhelmed by fear than those who have highly active imaginations. Emerson noticed this in his own day. He said, quote, "Men with little imagination are less fearful. They wait till they feel pain, whilst others of more sensibility, meaning imagination, anticipate it and suffer in the fear of the pang more acutely than in the pang itself." And we all know that this is true. We all can learn a great deal about ourselves by observing the imagination of fear, the fantasies that it conjures, and the stories that it brings up from our subconscious. Because fear reveals important aspects of who you are. You can tell a lot about a person by what she's afraid of. Every imagination is unique, and the fears that we carry are largely subjective. They are also irrational, contradictory, inconsistent, and often defy common sense. One person would rather jump out of a plane than give a toast at a wedding. Somebody else would prefer to work in a war zone than have an intimate relationship. I recently spoke to a woman who is unusually troubled by neuroses and insecurity, but she had an important teaching experience that showed her how paradoxical her own fears were. Now, mind you, this is somebody who's terrified of going into a department store. And yet, when she was asked a couple of years ago on short notice to volunteer as a counselor in a Syrian refugee camp, she agreed without hesitation. And she found herself a couple of weeks after that on the outskirts of Damascus doing intake work with people in terrible crisis. And this is what she said to me. She said, "I don't know what happened. I'd have thought I could never do something like this, but I wasn't afraid and I felt completely confident." She explained that while this courage made no sense to her rational mind, it couldn't be denied. And perhaps it was, she suggested, that it happened so suddenly that she didn't have the time to imagine all the horrible things that might happen. And once she'd said yes, it was too late. But she saw, and this is the important piece, the clear difference between her story of what this experience would be like and how it actually was. As a child who had grown up in a Jewish family, many of whose members had confronted the Holocaust, she was used to being with people in pain, to listening to their stories, offering care. And the experience on the ground wasn't nearly as unfamiliar or scary as she would have imagined. And that's because, again, fears are symptomatic of what we've been raised to expect, the consensus reality into which we've been born. What terrifies a kid on the streets of New York City is going to be different from what scares an Aboriginal child who's undergoing a rite of passage in the Australian outback, even though both may be forms of initiation. And this is an important thing to remember about fear. Fear and initiation are closely linked. Initiation is the imaginative process that transforms an individual from one identity to another. That's a very simplistic definition of what initiation is. It shifts our ideas about ourselves. It moves us from one identity to another. When this self-described neurotic returned from her trip to Syria, she was no longer the same. She had been awakened to how strong she actually was. She'd been awakened, in fact, to the self, the capital S self, the higher self that's beyond the small identity that's hemmed in by our fear-laden stories about who we are and what we're capable of. In her case, the journey became a kind of shamanic initiation, a shamanic experience. Since the dawn of time, shamanic traditions, which are the oldest spiritual systems on the planet, have understood this relationship between fear and initiation and how fear can be used as an awakening agent. The same thing goes for the hero's journey, which demands a call to adventure that tests the person's progress, tests their courage. And the same goes for what's known as the pilgrim's progress, which confronts seekers with the fear of losing their familiar self in the search for spiritual awakening. All of these examples suggest that fear is an integral ingredient on the path to becoming a whole human being. As Emerson put it, quote, "He has seen but half the world who has never been shown the house of pain." He has seen but half the world who has never been shown the house of pain. Passing through our fears in the process of awakening is understood to be necessary and good for the wisdom journey. And when you view fear in this sacred way, you come to recognize it as the demon that shakes you into facing up to who you really are. The demon that awakens you to your higher self. And demons can be our allies. It does this by showing you where you need care. That's how fear awakens us to the higher nature and helps to heal us. It shows us where we need care. It shows us where we need attention, unpacking, relaxing, support, information, comfort, and love. Like all types of pain, fear calls out for treatment in the form of some kind of tenderness. The more tender we are with our own fears, the closer we allow their proximity, the more we make space for them in our minds, the softer and the more pliant and the more instructive fear becomes. And it's then that the clench in the belly begins to relax, the heart in the mouth, the wobbly legs, the dread, the anxiety, the unmooredness that are part of being alive become less intolerable to us. Working with fear in this way is a case-by-case, moment-by-moment practice. The lump on your skin, the close call with a bus, the phone call from HR, the economic crash, the unexpected knock on the door, all of these serve to remind us of how close the potential for fear actually is and how precarious our illusions of safety and security turn out to be. It also shows us how extraordinarily brave we are for being able to navigate this tenuous landscape as well as we do, even though some days are obviously more courageous than others. Another important thing to remember about fear is that when we scrutinize the contents of fear, that is an excellent way of building courage when we look at what fear is made of. This is another ancient wisdom teaching that was popularized by the Stoics in particular, but also by the Buddhists and the Confucians. Attending to the thoughts and feelings that are associated with fear and discerning what fear is made of weakens the stranglehold that it has on the mind. Knowledge is the antidote to fear, you come to recognize. Our guest interview this month in the Seekers Forum, Rob Camerata, is one of the most courageous people that I've ever known. And she's going to have a lot to tell us about facing fear, having nursed her life partner, who happened to also be one of my oldest friends, through years of a medical ordeal that beggars the imagination. And what Rob learned is that knowledge and facing the truth were the most effective way of moving to a situation that she did not believe she could survive. Knowledge helps us to pierce the veil of appearance, and that automatically makes us stronger. When we're not fooled by how things look, by our ideas about them, but look at them up close instead and literally take them apart, see them for what they are, that is how we turn fear into an ally. Emerson compared this to confronting a bully. He compares the fearsome world to a kind of bully, and this is what he wrote, quote, "When a resolute young fellow steps up to the great bully, the world, and takes him boldly by the beard, he is often surprised it comes off in his hand, and that it was only tied on to scare away the timid adventurers." Isn't that wonderful? When a resolute young man steps up to this great bully, the world, and takes him boldly by the beard, he's often surprised by how it comes off in his hand, and that it was only tied on to scare the timid adventurers away. So the power to unbeard our fears, so to speak, is nurtured through careful attention. When we challenge our overreactions to things and notice how the appearance of fear differs from fear that is scrutinized, we tap into the strength of this larger self that we're talking about. You can call it your soul, your spirit, your witness, your metaphysical awareness. It's this part of you that is bigger than your circumstances. And that part of you, that part of us, is always larger than our fears as well. Confronted by the scariest things, we have the ability, when we quiet the mind, to practice self-inquiry, to look carefully at how we're relating to fear, examine the contents of the fear itself, and not be crushed by our imagination in order to stay present with things as they actually are. Anybody who has gone through very, very hard times knows that this is true. We know that terror has a shelf life just like everything else. Panic always passes away, if only for brief moments. And it's in those mental spaces between terrifying thoughts, when we're paying attention to things as they actually are in the present, that the way forward becomes clearer, that the next breath becomes possible. Speaking for myself, I can say that I've sat through terrible moments of life that my mind told me were impossible to get through, even as my body carried on. It's a little bit like being in a split screen reality, and I'm sure that many of you have had that experience. On one side of the screen, there's a voiceover that's blaring, I can't, it's too much, I'm dying, this has to stop. But on the other side of the screen, life carries on. You're walking your dog, writing in your journal, you're watering plants, or crying your heart out, or holding the hand of a child. Both are true, and it creates a sort of cognitive dissonance, finding yourself in a state of terror even as ordinary life moves forward. Such experiences put you on the receiving end of insight. You're in the direct path of insight when you're in that moment, when you're terrified and yet carrying on anyway. You can no longer deny where reality actually exists, that it's not in the imagination, it's not in your thoughts about what might be, or the conceptual realm of story or prediction or clenching or expectation. Instead, reality is in the body. It's in this very moment where your true self manages to go on being when fear says that it isn't possible. Your essential nature is always larger than your fears. And that's the most important lesson of all. It's the greatest gift of fear, to remind us that this is true. It wakes us up to what is real, spiritually speaking, and can never be lost. The great Indian saint Nisargadatta Maharaj said, "The real does not die, the unreal never lived." The real does not die, the unreal never lived. And that's what fear shows us. It shows us what's real and what isn't. And whatever it is that serves to remind us of this eternal fact is, in fact, our greatest ally on the path of awakening. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about fear and cultivating courage through insight. And now, Jay, why don't we pull up the card and we will do a bit of writing. I'd like you now, please, to take 15 minutes to write about what your current fears, the fears you're experiencing now in your life, are trying to teach you. What are your fears trying to teach you? And try to be as specific as you can be. We'll take 15 minutes to do that, please, and then we'll come back together as a group.